the prompt. Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, Jian, you're on.
My turn, okay. It is such a pleasure to be with each one of you tonight. Some of you, I guess most of you from Canada, some from the United States, some friends and family on this Zoom, as well as other parts of the world. This past Saturday, Baha'is around the world and their friends commemorated and honored the 100th anniversary of the passing of Abdu'l-Bahá. For those who may be unfamiliar, Abdu'l-Bahá was the son of Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i religion. And he was the head of the Baha'i community and its interpreter after Baha'u'llah's death in 1892. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, so if you bear with me for a second. It is a privilege to share some thoughts tonight on how Abdu'l-Bahá guided an early American Baha'i community in their response to racial prejudice. And when thinking about this topic, what fascinated me is that it was even more striking when we think that the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá starts in late 1892, corresponding so closely with the first mention of the Baha'i faith in North America in 1893. Now, to adequately cover this topic will be extremely challenging to do in 40 minutes. It almost feels nearly impossible. But I'm going to provide some very broad brushstrokes. And as a guide, I will go through the following in our 40 minutes, or I'll attempt to go through the following in our 40 minutes. First, I think it's always nice to share a story. And when we look at the example of Abdu'l-Bahá as it relates to racial justice, and tonight's focus will be on the United States. So for those dialing from Canada and other parts of the world, I hope to provide some context to make it somewhat easier to follow. But this story I'm going to provide highlights how Abdu'l-Bahá guides an early American Baha'i individual and how she has the courage to share guidance, racial harmony. Was there a...
Hello, how are you?
I'm hearing...
Can everybody please mute? Thank you.
And in this story, it highlights how Abdu'l-Bahá provides guidance to an early American Baha'i and her courage to share it with others and how it flows through the discourse of society at that time. The second area we're going to look at is a brief context of American history during the time that Abdu'l-Bahá engages this very early American Baha'i community and greater American society on the theme of racial harmony. And then we're going to briefly look at the core principle of the oneness of mankind as enshrined in Baha'u'llah's revelation, and on which Abdu'l-Bahá exemplifies in his actions, talks, and instructions. And then we'll look at two examples of Abdu'l-Bahá guiding an American Baha'i community on the principle of oneness of mankind and on racial justice and harmony. And these examples we'll look at will be his 1912 trip to North America and the 1921 Race Amity Conventions, which took place also 100 years ago this year, which he encouraged and guided. And then I will conclude with some closing remarks. Now let's start with this story. In May of 1912, so this was 1 month after Abdu'l-Bahá had arrived in North America, there is this full-page photo of Abdu'l-Bahá, and it is prominently featured in The Crisis, which is a magazine of the NAACP in the United States, the NAACP standing for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And you'll see that full-page photo to the left of this screen. He is highlighted in the section of Men of the Month. And there is an article which highlights his arrival in America, as well as a discussion of his life, sufferings, and the lives and teachings of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. And towards the end of this article, there is a reference to Abdu'l-Bahā's focus on racial harmony and an excerpt to an early American Baha'i. Her name was Mrs. M.L. Botay. And as you see on the right side of the screen, the passage reads, naturally, he, that being Abdu'l-Bahá, is interested in the question of race prejudice in this country, where he has so many disciples. Recently, he sent this message to one of them, Mrs. M.L. Botay, who has sent it to The Crisis. Give Miss Botay my greetings and love, and tell her she must greatly endeavor through the assistance of heaven to cast light among the colored people, so that they may become as our brothers, no blacks, no whites, both as one. By this means, you shall free Americans from all prejudice, because in the kingdom of God, all are the same, whether black or white. The greater the faith of either, the more acceptable he is in the kingdom. He looks upon qualities, not bodies. Again, he looks upon qualities, not bodies. And I found this article fascinating for so many reasons. First, it is in the publication of the NAACP, a civil rights organization focused on advancing racial equality and justice for African Americans. The NAACP, it is fascinating, was established in 1909, so shortly before Abdu'l-Bahā's visit. And its founders were leading Black intellectuals and activists of the time, including Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. Second, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is pictured to the left of this slide, who established The Crisis magazine and was its editor, penned the article. He was a leading scholar, activist, and the first Black American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. Du Bois had also met Abdu'l-Bahá that month in Chicago during Abdu'l-Bahā's fourth address to the fourth NAACP conference, which we will discuss shortly. And the third reason I am fascinated by this article is that it incorporates a message from Abdu'l-Bahá to an early believer, Mrs. Botay. Given my understanding of W.E.B. Du Bois, the fact that he incorporates this passage indicates the truly revolutionary nature of Abdu'l-Bahā's words. And the words of Abdu'l-Bahá addressed to Mrs. Botay are also so illuminating, as it demonstrates how Abdu'l-Bahá is guiding, nurturing, and encouraging an early American Baha'i community. And it demonstrates the confidence of this early American Baha'i in sharing his message with others. We have to remember that in 1912, when Abdu'l-Bahá comes to America or to North America, the North American Baha'i community is such a young one. It was less than 20 years before, as I mentioned at the beginning, that there was the first mention of the Baha'i faith in this country or in this continent. So this early community, this small band of believers, they were like seedlings, which Abdu'l-Bahá had sown and was nurturing in their understanding of Baha'u'llah's revelation and in the actions that they must take to demonstrate it. So who was Mrs. Botay? What insights can we glean from her experience that can help us learn more about the early American Baha'is and, more importantly, their commitment to racial harmony? I did some research at the archives, and there's some that we know, some things we know about her, and there's some things that we don't know. We don't know when she was born, and I don't think we even know where she was born, and I couldn't find a picture of her. We believe, based on correspondences between her and Abdu'l-Bahá, as well as other Baha'is, that her full name was Marian el-Boté. And based on the addresses of these letters, we know that she lived in New York City for a considerable part of her life, likely in these two buildings. We know that she was active in the teaching work, giving public talks and traveling around the Northeast United States. And for the Baha'is present, I think we also know, and this is very fascinating, is that she was one of 9 attendees at the marriage of Louis and Louisa Gregory. And she read one of 3 Baha'i prayers, and it was a prayer of Baha'u'llah for protection at the wedding. And most importantly, we know that through communications and meetings that take place between Mrs. Boté and Abdu'l-Bahá, he places the emphasis on her working towards racial justice and harmony. The first mention that I found of her dates back to a letter, a translated letter in January of 1902. So based on this, we know that she must have become a Baha'i in 1901 or earlier, just within probably 7 to 8 years of that first mention of the Baha'i faith in North America. In this tablet of Abdu'l-Bahá, as you will see here, he writes, and it's so beautiful, "O thou who art advancing to the kingdom of God, on perusing the contents of thy brilliant letter, I became cognizant of the secrets of thy heart that is illumined by the clear light. Know thou that the poor people hasten by parties to the kingdom of God. The weak become mighty before thy Lord. And the slaves, when entering the shadow of the Lord, attain the station of masters, Lord, and freed slaves in the presence of God." I am not sure if others caught this, but it is striking how Abdu'l-Bahá uses this reference of slave and master, Lord and freed slaves, and he completely reorients the terms, especially when thinking that the period of slavery and its attitudes were fresh in the memories of the North Americans. Let's remember that Robert Turner, the first African-American Baha'i, himself was born into slavery. And on this slide is the front and back of that translated letter that she received in January of 1902. We know that through communications to her directly or to other Baha'is, Abdu'l-Bahá continuously instructs her to work for racial justice and harmony. We also know that Mrs. Boté met Abdu'l-Bahá during his 1912 trip. She recollects, "Abdu'l-Bahá said to me that the affiliation of the white with the colored people was a great work in the cause of God, that I must strive to affiliate the hearts." He said the hearts were not affiliated yet. And if this condition between the white and colored people continued much longer, there was great danger. This story highlights to me 2 key points. First, Abdu'l-Bahá was focusing the American Baha'i community, this small band of believers so early in the development of the Baha'i faith in North America. He focuses them on embodying the principle of racial unity, the oneness of humankind, and being active champions for it. And second, what's fascinating about this story is the receptivity of his words, especially those in the forefront of discourse, as witnessed by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we will talk more about later. So for those of us that might not be as familiar with US history, what was the period like when Abdu'l-Bahá is addressing these Baha'is and the early American population? And what is the context? For those somewhat unfamiliar with American history, let us briefly go through some dates covering the post-US slavery period. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and later the 13th Amendment of 1865, after the US Civil War, emancipated all US slaves wherever they lived. However, emancipation didn't mean equality. Black Americans in the Southern United States faced what many Northern Blacks faced, but with potentially more severity. And that was of a free people surrounded in an environment of white hostility towards them. Efforts by the US government and the Northern states to reorganize the Southern states after the US Civil War, especially defining the means by which Blacks were afforded protections and could live alongside whites in a non-slave society, were short-lived. In a period that probably many of us have heard about, a period called Reconstruction. American Reconstruction lasted from 1865 only to 1877. Again, 1865 to 1877. And it was during this short period of American Reconstruction that Black Americans were allowed to vote, actively participate in the political process, acquire lands, seek employment, and use public accommodations. But as we know, and in observing our current environment, and this is not limited to the United States, these systems with roots in power and racism are hard to change. And those opposed to American Reconstruction during this 1865 to 1877 period, they found the means for rolling back the progress that had been made. White nationalism and anti-Black systems in the form of Jim Crow, which were state and local laws in the US that enforced racial segregation in the Southern United States, took a firm hold once again. The failure of American Reconstruction during the end of the 19th century, I think, was due to the absence of both the requisite institutional and societal will to eliminate racial prejudice. Again, it was due to this lack of both the institutional and societal will. Now, it is interesting that Abdu'l-Bahā's message, the revelation of Baha'u'llah, come at this period of time. And this message of Abdu'l-Bahá to this North American Baha'i community and population, it is rooted on the oneness of humanity, which is a core principle of Baha'u'llah's revelation, whose public proclamation in 1863 in the Garden of Rizwan was just several months after the Emancipation Proclamation in the United States, which emancipated the US slaves. And we will reflect a little more on this in my concluding remarks. When reflecting on the oneness of humanity and Baha'u'llah's mission, I am reminded of these words of the beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi, who was the grandson of Abdu'l-Bahá and the head of the Baha'i faith after Abdu'l-Bahā's passing. And this passage is from the World Order of Baha'u'llah. It reads, "Let there be no mistake. The principle of the oneness of mankind, the pivot round which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolve, is no mere outburst of ignorant emotionalism or an expression of vague and pious hope. Its implications are deeper. It does not constitute merely the enunciation of an ideal, but stands inseparably associated with an institution adequate to embody its truth, demonstrate its validity, and perpetrate its influence. It implies an organic change in the structure of present-day society, a change such as the world has not yet experienced. When we reflect on this, I think two themes become apparent. The Baha'i community's response to racial injustice, no matter where that community is, whether it is in the United States or Canada or any other part of the world, is part of a much larger arc enshrined in Baha'u'llah's revelation. This arc is spiritual in nature and centered on the oneness of humanity. And another theme or idea that has captivated is the idea to the right that the Baha'i revelation actually enshrines the most great reconstruction, the complete reconstruction, as referenced by early Baha'is Louis Gregory and Elaine Locke. This most great reconstruction is dependent on both the establishment of the administrative order and the corresponding transformation of the American people. This provides such a striking contrast and commentary on the deficiencies of US post-slavery reconstruction, which we discussed a little earlier. And it provides a glimpse of what Abdu'l-Bahá was guiding the American Baha'i community and America to achieve in his correspondences and during his 1912 trip to North America. The Americans had failed in Reconstruction at the end of the 1800s, and Abdu'l-Bahá was planting in the hearts of the American Baha'is and the population the seeds of the revelation or the principles of the revelation of Baha'u'llah, which were to erect that most great reconstruction that was so hoped for by the American people. It is against this backdrop that we can reflect and will perhaps never fully appreciate the guidance and example of Abdu'l-Bahá. As we had discussed from that very first mention of the Baha'i faith in North America in 1893, to the end of his earthly life in 1921, Abdu'l-Bahá is nurturing, tending, guiding, and pushing the American Baha'i community and greater American society on the implications and applications of the oneness of humanity. I know our time tonight is short, but in order to demonstrate this, I thought it would be helpful to briefly look at two concrete examples during two periods. The periods I want to look at are Abdu'l-Bahā's 1912 visit to North America, and then I want to look at the 1921 Race Amity Conventions, which correspond during the final year of Abdu'l-Bahā's life. During Abdu'l-Bahā's trip to North America in 1912, he is further laying the groundwork for the American Baha'i community's efforts to tackle racial injustice and prejudice. And there are some brief examples that I want to look at that relate to this, and they are very brief. One is how Abdu'l-Bahá is educating the Baha'i community. Two, how Abdu'l-Bahá is focusing engagement with centers of Black thought. And three, how Abdu'l-Bahá is propelling Baha'i thought to the vanguard of social discourse at that time. First, educating the Baha'i community. Many of us are familiar with the story of Louis Gregory and the Washington, D.C. luncheon, where Abdu'l-Bahá insisted that Louis Gregory be invited to the table. For those who may not be familiar about Louis Gregory was an African-American Baha'i known for his leadership qualities in the US and Washington, D.C. Baha'i communities. He was also known for his leadership qualities within larger society in Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. At the luncheon, Louis Gregory was not afforded a seat at the table until Abdu'l-Bahá reorganized the seating cards, placing Louis Gregory at the place of honor to his right side. As Gail Morrison reminds us in her incredible book, To Move the World, she writes, gently yet unmistakably, Abdu'l-Bahá had assaulted the customs of a city, that being Washington, D.C., that had been scandalized a decade earlier by President Roosevelt's dinner invitation to Booker T. Washington, a leading African-American scholar, author, and orator. Abdu'l-Bahá had also made his point to the Baha'is present of the actions the revelation of Baha'u'llah called them to do in their daily lives. And another example relates to Louis Gregory, and that is of his marriage to Louisa Matthews, which was an interracial marriage. And this example highlights yet again Abdu'l-Bahá challenging the social norms and customs of the time. We have to remember that this was incredibly bold at a time when 25 US states either prohibited or did not recognize interracial marriage. And it was a test to many American Baha'is on a change of attitude that the revelation called on them. And I am sure that for many on this call, there are numerous other examples that we can call to mind. The second theme during Abdu'l-Bahā's 1912 trip to North America that I want to focus on is his focused engagement with centers of Black thought at that time. Many of us who are familiar with Abdu'l-Bahā's trip to North America know that he often would focus his talks on man's spiritual reality. He would reorient the conversation, focusing that man is created in the image of God and that attainment of the divine perfections are what matters and not one's skin color. He also emphasized the beauty of a human family, diverse in color and oriented towards the divine perfections. Now, I think this is very important, especially given the discourse taking place in modern society, is his example that Abdu'l-Bahā's message always centered on facilitating love and friendship. He always focused on bringing hearts together, but he was always uncompromising in demonstrating justice. Examples of this include his talks at Howard University. Howard was the leading Black university in the United States. It was founded in 1866 with the focus of educating newly emancipated slaves. Then there was his talk at the Bethel Literary and Historical Society of the Metropolitan African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was a church that Frederick Douglass, a leading African-American activist and abolitionist, and many Canadians are familiar with him in their history. He frequently attended this church, and in fact, his funeral was held there in 1895. And then, as we discussed at the beginning, there was Abdu'l-Bahā's address at the 4th annual conference of the NAACP. And what is fascinating is that while Abdu'l-Bahá was in Washington, D.C., Shortly before he departs to Chicago, where this address would take place, Abdu'l-Bahá was invited to address a session of the United States Congress. And Abdu'l-Bahá turned it down. And I think this will ultimately make an interesting theme for a future talk. How Abdu'l-Bahá prioritizes two ultimately linked areas: Baha'i institutions with the dedication of the Baha'i temple site in Wilmette, Illinois, and two Black-centered, racial justice-centered discourse with his address at the NAACP. And he prioritizes these two things over the conventional US halls of power. When Abdu'l-Bahá opens his address at the Chicago NAACP conference, he starts his address stating, according to the words of the Old Testament, God has said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. This indicates that man is of the image and likeness of God. That is to say, the perfections of God, the divine virtues, are reflected or revealed in the human reality. Therefore, be it known that color or race is of no importance. He who is the image and likeness of God, who is the manifestation of the bestowals of God, is acceptable at the threshold of God. Whether his color be white, black, or brown, it matters not. Man is not man because of bodily attributes. The standard of divine measurement and judgment is his intelligence and spirits. What is striking about this? I'm sure many of us can pull out different themes that are so attractive. But for me, it is how Abdu'l-Bahá is focusing on man's spiritual reality. And this is at a time when many in society were looking at the characteristics of the human body to justify racial superiority. This was not just in Europe, in the United States, but it was in Europe and other colonized parts of the world, where individuals, scientists, those that were in power, were looking at bodily attributes, at physical characteristics to differentiate between the capacities of people. And the third theme of Abdu'l-Bahā's 1912 trip that I think deserves attention is how he is propelling thought to the center of social discourse. He does this through his public addresses and meetings, which are to leave deep impressions on many. And these relationships would serve to reinforce collaborations with the Baha'i community. After W.E.B. Du Bois published that May 1912 article in the Crisis magazine, where he had the picture of Abdu'l-Bahá as part of the Men of the Month section, the following month, he takes the speech of Abdu'l-Bahá at the Chicago Convention and prints it in its entirety in the June edition of the Crisis magazine, propelling Abdu'l-Bahā's words across this country. As Guy Emerson Mount writes, Du Bois's encounter with Abdu'l-Bahá was much more than a fleeting encounter. Du Bois's NAACP remained institutionally linked to the Baha'i faith for the remainder of his life. And this is so touching when we think about Abdu'l-Bahā's passing in 1921, and when we honor him and reflect all the honors that he received, or tributes that were paid to him 100 years ago. There was also this tribute of W.E.B. Du Bois upon his death, where he writes in the Crisis magazine, two men sit high before the world today, Eugene Debs and Abdu'l-Bahá. His trip to Chicago also attracted other leading Black Americans, including Alain Locke, who was the dean, the father of the Harlem Renaissance. Ida B. Wells, an activist and founder of the NAACP. Robert Abbott, who was also the founder of the Chicago Defender, the leading African-American newspaper of the time. And the author and orator, James Weldon Johnson, whose writings we will review shortly. In fact, Alain Locke and Robert Abbott would become Baha'is in 1918 and 1934, respectively, all attracted by that encounter with Abdu'l-Bahá in 1912. As we discussed, Abdu'l-Bahā's talks and principles, what he articulated, were distributed widely, either directly or indirectly. It was not just through the Crisis magazine, but it was also through the Chicago Defender, through other books and publications. All we have to do is look at Alain Locke's well-known anthology, The New Negro, to see how the influence of Abdu'l-Bahā's words and the Baha'i revelation has on his writings and his own themes. So we just discussed a few examples, a few themes during Abdu'l-Bahā's 1912 trip to North America. We examined how he nurtures and guides an early American Baha'i community. We examine how he engages with the American population, focuses attention on centers of Black thought, propels social discourse, guides individuals through love on how their actions must be reflective of these divine principles. The second example that I want to focus on, or the second theme, is the race amity conventions, which were launched in 1921. These conventions were, in large sense, a response to Red Summer of 1919. In the few short years following Abdu'l-Bahā's trip to North America in 1912, we all know that World War I would propel changes at the macro and micro levels. In America, industrial labor shortages, especially in manufacturing, drove companies in industrial cities, mostly in the northern states, to recruit Black Americans in the southern states. This led to the first period of what was called the Great Migration. By the end of 1919, approximately 1 million Black Americans left the South to the North. And this mass movement of individuals, their growth of their social and political engagement in community life, intensified white resentment in the North, especially when veterans were returning back from World War I. They faced job shortages in the market. And the tensions that Abdu'l-Bahá had warned of were reaching a boiling point. And then in 1919, America had reached a phase of nationwide anti-Black violence that had not been witnessed in the post-US slavery period. Red Summer of 1919 was coined by James Weldon Johnson. If you remember, we just discussed how he also engaged with Abdu'l-Bahá and the Baha'i community. And James Weldon Johnson coins it Red Summer of 1919 to describe that period from the late winter to early autumn of that year, where racial violence swept across the US. Over 25 major riots and mob actions were recorded, with countless more incidents of anti-Black violence taking place across cities in the United States. Writing of the events in Washington, D.C., James Weldon Johnson penned this. He remarked, "I knew it to be true but it was almost an impossibility for me to realize as a truth that men and women of my race were being mobbed, chased, dragged from streetcars, beaten and killed within the shadow of the dome of the Capitol, at the very front door of the White House. Red Summer and the deteriorating racial landscape in America was of great concern to Abdu'l-Bahá. It was during during Agnes Parson, who was an early American Baha'i, during her visit in 1920 to Palestine, that Abdu'l-Bahá entrusted Mrs. Parsons with instructions for race amity conventions to be rolled out in America. For those who may be familiar with the word amity, it means friendship. So Abdu'l-Bahá was centering this on bringing friendship among the races. Abdu'l-Bahā's plan was the initiation of a series of large, well-publicized interracial meetings conducted to proclaim the oneness of mankind and to promote racial amity, friendship between Black and white Americans. We have to remember that such conferences or conventions for racial amity were literally unprecedented at the time. And it's fascinating. Who does Abdu'l-Bahá choose to spearhead this? He chooses Agnes Parsons. Mrs. Parsons had in fact herself become a Baha'i in 1910, just 2 years before Abdu'l-Bahā's visit to North America and 10 years before her pilgrimage to see him in 1920 in Palestine. Who was she? She was an established Washington, D.C. social. She was known for her philanthropy. But she may have reflected the white liberal orientation of the time, intellectually against racial prejudice, but still influenced by the sense of superiority, which was common in her class. This is who Abdu'l-Bahá entrusts to spearhead this vital race amity work. But what did Abdu'l-Bahá see? It was her devotion. It was her capacity. It was her acceptance of the revelation of Baha'u'llah and exposure to and active participation in an interracial community that expanded her consciousness, uplifted her actions, and elevated her understanding of the implications of Baha'u'llah's revelations. This was really the transformation which Abdu'l-Bahá was nurturing with the early American Baha'i believers. He never belittled anybody. He always elevated them, caused them to see their own capacity, orient themselves towards the principles. And again, he was the uncompromising in what he expected of them to do in terms of demonstrating justice. And he was the example of that, as we saw in the examples during his 1912 trip. Louis Gregory understood the wisdom of the selection of Mrs. Parsons, and I love finding this, what he wrote. He said, a white Baha'i of wealth and social prominence, no one could question the motives of such a soul when you consider both her spiritual illumination, devotion added to her worldly station. The first race amity conventions were held on May 19th through 22nd, 1921, the first one being at Washington's First Congregational Church. Reading accounts of the planning for this convention is absolutely fascinating. Finding it difficult to figure out and approach the spirit for the convention, Mrs. Parsons, in fact, consulted with a former US Senator, Moses Clapp of Nebraska. His guidance was lift the whole matter up to the spiritual realm and work for the creation of sentiment. And Louis Gregory also agreed. He said, nothing short of a change of hearts will do, unless the speakers are able to make the power of love felt. The occasion will lose its chief value. And this was such a contrast with the discourse taking place on this topic during that time. Leading up to the convention, 19,000, let me say that again, 19,000 programs were circulated throughout Washington, D.C. They were passed out in schools, churches, hotels, stores, and other public spaces. US President Warren Harding, it is said, knew about the convention and unofficially supported it. When studying that first convention, what really struck me was the wording the Baha'i community used for the invitation and programs to describe the convention. And I think when we're going to review it now, when we read it, I think we're all going to be struck by the maturation and the development of this early American Baha'i community. Still, less than 30 years since that first mention of the Baha'i faith in North America. These seedlings were becoming stronger in STEM, firmer, oriented. They were learning from Abdu'l-Bahá. Let us read what they write to describe the event. They wrote, half a century ago in America, slavery was abolished. Now there has risen the need for another great effort in order that prejudice may become overcome. Correction of the present wrong requires no army, for the field of action is the hearts of our citizens. The instrument to be used is kindness, the ammunition, understanding. The actors in this engagement for right are all the inhabitants of this United States. The great work we have to do and for which this convention is called is the establishment of amity between the white and colored people of our land. And then this last sentence really hits me. When we have put our own house in order, then we may be trusted to carry the message of universal peace to all mankind. On the evening of the convention's opening on May 19th, there was a large audience of about 2,000 people packed into a hall. Abdu'l-Bahá sent a message writing, "Say to this convention that never since the beginning of time has one more important been held. This convention stands for the oneness of humanity. Say to this convention that never since the beginning of time has one more important been held. This convention stands for the oneness of humanity, which is that principle that is the pivot around which Baha'u'llah's teachings revolve, to which that American population, as well as other populations in the world, must demonstrate and exemplify." Just 1 month before Abdu'l-Bahā's passing, he writes this letter to Mrs. Parsons. He says, "The convention of the colored and white was in reality a great work, because if the question of colored and white should not be resolved, it would be productive of great dangers in the future of America." It is also fascinating that even in those days in November, just weeks before Abdu'l-Bahā's passing, he is continuing to guide the American Baha'i community in their work towards eliminating racial prejudice and seeding their understanding of what justice entails. These conventions not only offered America a forum to reflect on the principles that underlie the oneness of humanity, those building blocks of the most great reconstruction, but it also strengthened the Baha'i community's engagement with like-minded organizations, leaders, and at the grassroots levels. So in conclusion, we started this presentation, maybe it was 40 minutes ago, reflecting on Abdu'l-Bahá's letter to an early American Baha'i. We remember her name was Marian L. Ote. And we saw the impact that this letter had on W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading American philosopher, thinker, and orator. When I reflect on a passage from his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk, many of you might be familiar with Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk. He wrote this 9 years before meeting Abdu'l-Bahá. And he writes this passage about slavery and emancipation. So this has to do with the period of slavery and then emancipation being when they were freed from their bondage. On reflecting during of this period, he writes that during the period of slavery, he says, for 50 years, Negro religion thus transformed itself and identified itself with the dream of abolition, that is the abolition of slavery. Until that which was a radical fad in the white North and an anarchist plot in the white South had become a religion in the Black world. Thus, when emancipation finally came, so that was in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, it seemed to the freedman a literal coming of the Lord. His fervid imagination was stirred as never before by the tramp of armies, the blood and dust of battle, and the wail and whirl of social upheaval. He stood dumb and motionless before the whirlwind. What had he to do with it? Was it not the Lord's doing and marvelous in his eyes? Joyed and bewildered with what came, he stood awaiting new wonders till the inevitable age of reaction swept over the nation and brought the crisis of today. But back of this still broods silently the deep religious feeling of the real Negro heart. The stirring, unguided might of powerful human souls who have lost the guiding star of the past and seek in the great night a new religious ideal. I wonder whether the new religious ideal that Du Bois is referring to is in fact really captured in Baha'u'llah's revelation and the principle of the oneness of mankind. To close, reflecting on what we discussed shows that a century ago, this nascent American Baha'i community, under the unyielding guidance of Abdu'l-Bahá, laid the foundation for participation in the most vital social discourse of the time. By standing at the vanguard of discourse and forging bonds with communities at the center of Black thought, this American Baha'i community was engaged in a revolutionary type of social action, refusing to shy away from the most contentious issues of the day, recognizing that is precisely where the spiritual balm of Baha'u'llah's revelation must be applied. It is a legacy we all inherit and must seize with the audacity Abdu'l-Bahá urged in our spiritual forebears. It is the administrative order through the guidance of the universal house of justice that humanity will propel forward towards that most great reconstruction referenced by Louis Gregory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jian. That was beautiful. And I think equally the way in which you conveyed this information was so befitting of the information that was conveyed. And I think that made your presentation very special. So thank you so much for that. And I want to open the floor to any questions or comments that anyone might have. I'm just gonna adjust my view, but if you have any comments or questions for Jian, if you could please raise your hand and I will call upon you.
Sorry, my computer died there. So I am jumping onto my mom's computer.
Okay. I have one question that I see from dear Faride John. Allah Hapa Faride John.
Allah Hapa, I am so sorry. I thought Chicago time 7. I came late. It was wonderful. I love Jian and the family. I love them so much. If possible, to send this presentation for me, because it was wonderful. He was talking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Faride John. I'm not sure. What I can tell you is that this presentation was recorded and it's going to be available on Oakville Baha'is page on YouTube. Is that correct, Farouz? Is it Oakville Baha'is? Baha'is of Oakville, sorry, Baha'is of Oakville. So this presentation was recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel entitled Baha'is of Oakville, Faride John. So if you would like to have access to this presentation, it will be uploaded. I'm not sure how long it takes, but in principle, it will be available on the Baha'is of Oakville YouTube channel.
In a few days.
In a few days.
Thank you so much. And this few days, next Thursday, I'm flying to South America, travel teaching and run from the winter of the Chicago. And 4 months I come back because now I'm in the resident in Chicago because I love the Baha'i temple. I am there 24 hours. Love you, love you. Thank you, Jian. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Faride John. Thank you. And we wish you lots of blessings and good luck on your travels. Our next, I think the next hand that I see is dearest Nikki June. Nikki June, Alapa.
Hello. I just have a question. I think maybe some other people, they have the same kind of questions. you know, for years, United States and also European country, they were working towards the elimination of, you know, prejudices regarding the color of skin. And I wanted to ask whether dear Jian has given the answer to it, that what causes that this unity still is among, and what causes that still we see these prejudices after so long years, so many. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. And, you know, I can share some of my thoughts, but I do want to make sure to open this up to others, because it's not necessarily just a conversation with the speaker. I think it is a conversation for all of us in terms of why do these prejudices, which Abdu'l-Bahá had been working with the Baha'i community and the greater population to address.
Excuse me, Jian, I can't see you because this is being recorded. Everybody can see Jian except me.
Can you hear me?
We can see him.
No, we cannot see him. No, we
Can't
cannot
see you, but we can hear you, but we want to see you.
But I see him. I
My
see him.
I
computer,
can see you. I can see you. I can hear you.
Yes,
I
I do too.
I see you
Very clear.
on a
you
different
know what happened
screen.
was right after I talked, my computer died, but somehow it didn't die. The screen, I think, got shot. So that's why you see kind of a black image, but I'm dialing in from my parents' computer.
No, but we
Okay.
see you, Jian John, so you can continue.
We
Go
see
ahead.
you now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
good now.
So, you know, I think this is, you know, the fact that racial prejudice exists all these years. And these roots of prejudice still find its way in different structures, both institutionally, but also in different structures of our society. And how is it that we address it, right? You know, racial injustice and economic injustice, and, you know, all of these are so closely intertwined and connected. And I think, you know, it probably deserves kind of reflection amongst all of us in the patterns that we see around us, the causes for it, and how is it that we cleanse ourselves? Because naturally, when we are bombarded with this, and even in its both its subtle and not so subtle forms, how do we cleanse ourselves from being influenced and impacted by it?
May I ask Professor Sayu if he has a question, and he knows that we always ask him questions. So please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jen, for such a wonderful talk. So I have a question that when you were talking about, there was an arc that you talk about, and I was just wondering, is that a metaphor or what? I just need more explanation.
Yeah. The reason I was looking at this,
Mhm.
I use this metaphor of the ark, is that when we look at that period of early 1900s, when we look at what Abdu'l-Bahá was guiding an early American Baha'i community to do, when we look at his trip in 1912, when we examine the Race Amity Convention, when we look at what Baha'is are engaged in the world today, they are not disparate events or initiatives. I wanted to highlight, using that metaphor, they are all connected and that they are centered on this principle of the oneness of humanity. And that is the ultimate objective in which Abdu'l-Bahá, as well as the institutions of the Baha'i faith, are orienting not just the Baha'i community, but through their engagement with society at large or populations at large, where they're orienting the discussion and the action around. Because I think sometimes when we lose that is the core, that is the objective, then we can see these as isolated events and not necessarily spend time reflecting on the growth that is taking place and where that, if it be a plant, where that plant is oriented towards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Ziai.
Yes, I have a primitive question. Do we know throughout the world where African Americans have had least problems and has been most welcome?
So you mean in the world where they have received the most acceptance?
Yes.
You know, I am not familiar. I'm not familiar. I don't know if others are.
I do have a little snippet about that, and I don't think there's anywhere that there's been racial justice, particularly with respect to African Americans or Black people in general. But I do know that James Baldwin, who is the very famous African American writer and I believe playwright and activist, moved to Paris because he said that he wanted to be somewhere where he wasn't constantly aware of his Blackness, and so that he could write, and he kind of wrote one of his seminal works while he was in Paris. And I don't think that necessarily Paris is some kind of promised land in any way, shape, or form, but I think that for Black artists, and I don't remember what other Black artists, but I think there was a female singer, I believe she was, I forget her name. She also moved to Paris, to France, and before James Baldwin. But there was a small exodus of, and probably exodus is overreaching, a small migration of Black intellectuals and artists, African American intellectuals and artists, who moved to Europe, specifically Paris, also because it was a cultural center, and felt that they were able to be more free there. There was no Jim Crow, and they were respected for their craft and for being artists, and not just viewed in their own words as just being Black. So that's the limited amount of information I have about that.
Yeah, and his videos on YouTube, if you Google him on YouTube and hear his interviews, they are absolutely fascinating and so moving. That was a great example.
Jian, can I answer that question before Shahla June raises her question? And this is a little bit of a devil advocate, but Dr. Ziai, I could say the Baha'i World Center.
So Dr. Ziai, I apologize. I always see my mother speaking to your wife and calling her Dr. Ziai. So I just assumed that your wife was Dr. Ziai and that you are Mr. Ziai. So now I think possibly you're both Dr. Ziai. So I apologize for not addressing you properly.
For several years I have retired, so I'm no longer acting the profession. So please call me Fuad.
Shahla Khanum, please.
Yes, you mentioned the Holy Land, yes, but of course Paris was a place a lot of people fled when they had no refuge anywhere else in those days. So Paris was, but what I want to raise is that Canada has a lot of connection, especially Montreal, to slavery and the South. And it's fascinating that when the Civil War happened, the Jefferson, if I'm not wrong, moved to Montreal. And in those days, when I moved to Montreal, it seems like 200 years ago, in the 60s, there was this gorgeous house between the bay and Eaton's, and this gorgeous house in front of a church, a very gorgeous church, which still exists, and across from Philip Square on St. Catherine. And he lived there for many years. I don't know, it may have been 60 years. No, the plaque was removed after 60 years in 2020, but he lived there. And then somebody bought that property in the 50s or 60s. And before the city of Montreal could call it historical, they went overnight and demolished it. And so then the city of Montreal refused to give them permit to build. For years, it was just a piece of land and used as parking. And then eventually it became, they allowed them to build, and there's shopping center underneath, 7th floor. And then of course it's a high rise. And of course, we are sorry to have lost that historical home, because it was the house that was connected to the church that brought them. Also, those who came after the Civil War, they brought slaves with them. And actually, if I'm not wrong, 2,000 of their slaves, they brought with them to Montreal. And they settled in Lower Canada and Upper Canada. And then in a few years later, Upper Canada did not free the slaves, but did not allow anyone to bring any more slaves to Canada. And of course, in 1834, when British outlawed it, Canada also became part of that Commonwealth or the colonies that was accepted that law. But what's so fascinating is that in 1920s, Montreal became the center of jazz. And so many African Americans came to Montreal. And over the years, I remember that in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2 million people would come to Montreal to listen to jazz over a period of a week, and many African American. But on later years, most of the Africans that came to Canada were from the Caribbeans. And then, of course, there was the Underground Railroad, which brought many of the slaves to North Canada. But then recently, most of the Africans who have come to Canada have come from French Africa. So, because there is an arrangement between Quebec and University of Montreal that any Africans that are from French colonies can come to Montreal and go to University of Montreal paying tuition similar to Canadians. So we now have a large number of, and many of children classes and junior youth that we have here are from these groups. So it's a wonderful thing to have the multicultural. They didn't want them, we love them, we want them.
So I have a question. Thank you, Shahla, for everybody. In that, as this past Saturday we commemorated, and I guess throughout this year we are commemorating and honoring the life of Abdu'l-Bahá. I wonder if kind of any of the stories that were shared tonight resonated or particularly striking, or if there are other stories that each of you have that might not have been discussed tonight, but you feel really highlight this theme of Abdu'l-Bahá guiding through his example and through his guidance, the community on this idea of racial justice and harmony. It's always so wonderful to hear stories that are in the hearts of others as we think about this year too.
Another question.
Yeah, so
Yeah, another question. What was in Abdu'l-Bahá's approach that it was so attractive to others and they all believed him in his sincerity and his bold action to get the marriage between two races? It was not easy, but they accepted his orders. He says, go get married this lady, and he does that, and vice versa. It doesn't happen anymore. What happened to those qualities?
Yeah, I mean, I think all of these individuals were so, I mean, they loved Abdu'l-Bahá so much. And it was their love for Abdu'l-Bahá, and it was how Abdu'l-Bahá also how he knew how to encourage each one of them. And the loving way he encouraged them to move forward and propel forward, but always with love. And I think that must have been what caused them to really challenge their own actions or their own conceptions or their own thoughts. You know, it must have been that love that he engendered, but also the encouragement that he provided. You know, there is this, and this is a little bit on the side, if we're going to talk about stories of Abdu'l-Bahá, you know, there is this wonderful story that I read, and I can't remember in which book, and it was when Abdu'l-Bahá was in New York City. And a reporter asked Abdu'l-Bahá, and it's kind of like a typical American reporter question, I feel. It's like, if you could sum up the Baha'i faith in one word, what would it be? It's like, if you can sum up the revelation that humanity has been waiting for in thousands of years, like, what is that one word you would sum it up? And I don't know much of the context of that question other than that question was asked. So I don't know what was in Abdu'l-Bahā's mind when he answered the question, what he was thinking about. But, when I would have thought, his response might have been love, unity, and his response was that if you were to sum up the Baha'i faith and the revelation of Baha'u'llah in one word, it would be encouragement. And it's such a beautiful reflection, because that is really what Abdu'l-Bahá was doing. That is what I think the essence of the Baha'i revelation is. It's that it's encouraging each soul to take that step. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we are influenced by the norms of our society. We are influenced by our families. We are influenced by our backgrounds. But it's always that encouragement to take that step forward. And so that stuck out right now. When Dr. Ziai asked the question, that's what Abdu'l-Bahá, to me, also exemplified encouragement. And I think when people feel that sincerity of encouragement, no matter how scary it might feel, no matter how bold, they take that step.
I think that's such a beautiful story and statement. And I think it really speaks to the fact that, I think that there's a lot of different ways of dealing with injustice and a lot of different ways of approaching individuals in unjust systems that make up unjust systems and create then, systemic racism or bias of any kind. And I think that this idea of encouragement is so important, because I think many of these people, I'd like to think many of these people who are pillars of these institutions, if they knew they had somewhere else to go, where it wasn't a place of being brandished for having been in that institution, but a place from which they could go forward into the light, so to speak. They would cross that bridge. But I think that because that sense of encouragement is often missing, people stay mired in their racism. People stay mired in their injustice because they don't feel like there's anywhere to go. And they feel that if wherever else there is to go, it's going to be, the shadow of their past is going to constantly vilify and follow them. And so I think that that's something so this whole idea of encouragement, without encouragement, you really can't transform people. Yeah. And if you can't transform people, you're never going to have systemic change, and you're never going to have any kind of change. So I think that, it's I see this as a woman, in the sense that, I meet people who are very kind, and then somebody who, like a male person, will make a joke that's very inappropriate, and shouldn't have been made, and I think, okay, what is my choice right now? Is to get angry, and I'm justifiably angry, or to respond in a more innovative way, and to let that person know that he can cross a bridge to a place where he won't say that again, but not because he feels really dark about it. Mm-hmm. And so I obviously don't have an experience of being African American, but as a woman, I do have that experience, and it takes a lot, because your first instinct is to become defensive and to become offensive. But the example of Abdu'l-Bahá is very clear, and it's unmistakable. And it's this example of encouragement with justice, without losing sight of justice. And so I really love that story. Thank you so much, Jian. Is there anyone else who has a story, as Jian asked for, or a question for Jian?
I have a question. I wasn't going to raise it, but when you spoke, I thought maybe I should. My question is to Mr. Khadim. Do you think that we can eliminate racism without eliminating sexism? Because I think that, to my thinking, racism and sexism go hand in hand. I deeply believe, and every time I've raised this question, people have got upset because they think that if you raise sexism and talk about sexism, that racism is going to be watered down. But I think if 50% of the people of the world who are women are not equal, then we are not equal. So that's been my question for years. Can we eliminate one without the other?
It's a hard question. I think what comes to mind now is that what is that underlying principle, right? That underlying principle. And I just think about, even when Abdu'l-Bahá, when he comes to America, he's talking about racial harmony. He's also talking about the equality of women and men too. But it is all rooted on this principle of the spiritual reality of the individual, right? And so when we address that principle fully, then I think these other iniquities become addressed. But we also know, Abdu'l-Bahá also, and this applies to the United States, he had a warning for the United States that if it did not address racial prejudice or injustice, that there would be great danger for this country. We also know that the beloved guardian, in his instructions to the American Baha'i community, where he was actually addressing it to the Baha'i community itself, called racism the most challenging issue confronting this country. I don't think it means that one is at, one is at odds with the other. I think it is when that principle is addressed that these injustices or these iniquities will become right. But I also know that there is a danger that Abdu'l-Bahá warned about, and especially to the United States, about racial prejudice too. So I agree with you, Shala. It's not one or the other. It is all centered on that principle. And the lack of that principle, the manifestation of that, has different, manifestation of it has both commonalities and differences in how it is, how it is felt in humanity. I'm curious about your thought to that question too, after what you had just shared about your experience.
I think that racial problem comes from sexism. And the reason I say that, there's a film called The Burning Times. And it's about the Holocaust of women. For 3 centuries in Europe, they burned women mostly and villages in the name of witchcraft.
Yeah.
University that opened to men for law and medicine and not to women. And women were midwives and healers. How do you take away a job from a group and give it to another? In order to do that, they created this whole aspect of witchcraft. 3 centuries, children watched their mothers be ducked into the river, and if they didn't drown, then they were burned. Villages were burned. And this did not surface until American monks went to Europe to study the languages in the monasteries. And when they went there and started reading that language, they came across all these documents, because there were no graves, but they were all documented. And this, I think about, called the 3rd degree, came from there. One monk said, you torture someone. First, instead, they will deny that they have slept with the devil. Then go to the 2nd degree, and then go to the 3rd degree. They will be willing to confess anything. And so these women were imprisoned. And of course, remember, there were wars between the Christians and the Muslims. And those wars killed many of the men, European men. So they were very wealthy women who had land and who were not under the control of the church. So that was what happened. Then it was so successful that it was used to go to Africa. 30 million Africans were destroyed and enslaved as a result of slavery. The whole of the African continent still is suffering from what the Europeans did in Africa. They have not recovered, even though many of those countries received their independence in the 60s. So I think, and then a film was made by actually a Canadian and showed at the Concordia University. And if anyone has a chance to watch The Burning Times, it's very hard to watch, but gives you some idea of how successful were the European in taking away wealth and jobs from women and giving it to men. And when they were able to make women second-class citizens, then it was easy to make anyone else a second-class citizen. Actually, many of them believed or wrote that women's brain was smaller and less intelligent because of its size. And they did the same to the Africans. So we need to study what happened to women in order to get a sense of what happened to African Americans. Sorry, I'm big-winded.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think one of the messages of the Baha'i faith is to deliver ourselves from the past history, to stop living in the past. If you continue to live in the past, to continue make movies of the past, then you never go to a higher class and have a better living. Look at the tone of Baha'u'llah's message to the emperors and the kings of United States when compared to the commanders of people in Europe. It's totally different, because people who came to the United States, they decided to forget their past and begin to have a different life according to what is best for them. And that's why Abdu'l-Bahá comes here and spends so long in here, because he sees there is a potentiality here for change of mind and living a different life. So we as Baha'is, in fact, jokingly, it was said that the best place for African Americans to live is the Holy Land. It is true, because those who have decided to become Baha'is, they have decided to forget their past and begin to have a new perspective for life. And all of us as Baha'is have had experiences at work, how that hidden influence and education has made us distinguished as those who do not have any problems with the present, and they are not pulling by force the past to the future, to the present. You live in the future, and that's what Abdu'l-Bahá was here to help that transformation, that forget about the past. And all of those documentaries and evidences that those little children had come and say that I am here because Abdu'l-Bahá was here and made my parents to get married, so I'm having a happy life and not prejudiced life. So I disagree with you for your persistence in living in the past.
The one thing, just the one reflection I had in the Mariam is, like, I do think that there's a beautiful concept there of how Abdu'l-Bahá also saw the capacity, especially when he comes to this country, for people to change, or that even though it was mired in prejudices or inequalities, there was a growth in this sentiment that change is needed. I mean, when we think about not just the examples of Louis Gregory or W.E.B. Du Bois or Alain Locke, who the beloved guardian later asked to review his translation of the Kitab-i-Iqan. One of two people, I think it was George Townsend and Alain Locke, who the beloved guardian asked to review that translation. We also see the example of Abdu'l-Bahá and Mother True, or Mrs. True, and leading the efforts of High Temple Unity, which was kind of the precursor of our institutions, right? Also Mrs. Parsons, right? He had her take that leadership at a time when, we know in the case of Mrs. True, Mrs. Parsons, we also can look at other examples where it was against the norms of that time, where Abdu'l-Bahá was challenging it and also focusing on the role women had to play in leadership positions, regardless of the sphere. Mariam, I know I asked the question to you initially, and so every time I see the unmute button go off, I see it come right back on. So it's you, Mariam.
I just want to say that I thank you so much, Mrs. Stee, for what you said. I actually think, you know, I think about this a lot as well. And I do agree in the sense that I think that before, you know, any white man and a Black man met, or any white man and Indigenous person met, men and women met, and the dynamic was unjust, and it was one of subjugation. And that is the dynamic then that moved on to create the injustice that we see in the world. Wherever we see it, that dynamic originated in the dynamic of men and women. And I think that's quite undeniable. I also think that, you know, looking at the past, definitely, you know, sinking into thinking about the past is different than analyzing the past so that you can move forward to a brighter future. And I think that's why I loved Jian's presentation so much, because there was no denial of what had happened, but there was only a focus on moving forward and how Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged everyone to move forward. And I think one of the most beautiful stories of Abdu'l-Bahá, I think, is the story of Thomas Breakwell. When Thomas Breakwell came and saw Abdu'l-Bahá, and he was so overcome with this sense of guilt because he had been working in the, you know, I don't remember exactly what industry, but it had included child labor at the time, and Abdu'l-Bahá hugged him, and Abdu'l-Bahá loved him so much. And soon after he died, so Abdu'l-Bahá hugged him and said, you need to quit your job. And he quit his job, and then he died. And I think that this is such an incredible testament to redemption